Hello, and thank you for being here with me today as we embark on our next magical action. Right? We've got this amazing little magical creature who has been dealt a hand or a situation that she has absolutely no way to process, and she just starts running. She just gets the hell out, right? So at that point, comes the question. We're circling back to that initial question of where am I? Right? I'm nowhere, yet everywhere, all at the same time. And what does that mean? Now, fragmentation literally means the process or state of breaking or being broken into smaller separate parts. That's pretty literal and easy to picture, right? Now, if you can't create a picture around a thought, the words you're choosing don't really mean anything. So throw the adjectives away. It's just air pollution. We are looking for actionable words, right? Now, the nearest picture I can create for what this felt like was comparatively a jigsaw puzzle, right? One picture broken into numerous different pieces. Now, the magic is that when all the pieces are put together correctly, we have a completely connected whole. So that doesn't mean that anyone's ill. That means they just forgot where they put parts of themselves, right? So, what happens when you get to the end and there are several missing pieces in a jigsaw puzzle for you guys out there that love puzzles, right? That picture leaves you feeling uncomfortable and uncertain around the missing pieces, right? And that's just, a 3D thing over there that means nothing. We also know that often we put in one piece in the puzzle and a whole bunch of pieces just magically seem to fall into place. Now, let's kind of step back and visualize what that would feel like from the inside out, knowing that pieces are missing, chunks of information are missing. You feel haunted. You don't know why, and you don't really know by who, right? You just feel like you're trapped in a haunted house full of, what are those mirrors called? Those wavy mirrors dis- that distort everything, right? Nothing feels real. Nothing seems to fit your truth, right? So, our quantum action number 2 is fragmentation, right? And could there be a literal fragmentation? And if so, right, what's fragmenting? As we spoke about in the last module, our astral body is what's fragmenting. Our astral body has molecules. Our astral body is our life force, right? So if we're breaking it into little pieces, it stands to reason that they would all, like a magnet, be drawing or being called back to the whole, right? Now, back to that 21-gram experiment that had stuck in my awareness so many years ago, right? And again, what really stuck with me was that he could not define the discrepancy. There was a discrepancy. The discrepancy was in that he could not get a definable weight discrepancy on the other side of death, right? He would minus out all the body fluids and waste that our bodies would release at the point of death. And then there was undefined discrepancy in the amount of weight loss that was left over. I was fascinated by this. So, would our fragmentation be the reason that there was a discrepancy? If you took a person that had not been fragmented, did not have PTSD, their astral body would weigh more than the person that was fragmented and scattered through time. Now, we have to understand in a very clear way that we're talking real molecules of your astral body scattered through time, and they're trapped and frozen, afraid and alone and tired because they're always fighting. They're always fighting to be seen and be reunited into the whole, right? I spent most of my life running to where it didn't really matter, running to where I didn't know, running away from what I thought was some monster, right? Always something was chasing me. Always, always, always. And what was real was one day, in one of my huge panics, I hear stop, just stop and turn around. And what I saw was me, afraid, wanting to be seen, wanting to be heard, wanting to be held, wanting to be brought back home. Nobody else had given me that. Anybody that tried and throughout the years couldn't give me that because I couldn't give it to myself, right? So if I can't see me and I can't hear me, no one else can, right? We can only receive what we can give to ourselves. So, what we must keep in mind for these folks as well is the Nest family doubtfully is offering any level of validation. Instead, what is most common is the gaslighting continues into today, right? And often the victim is held responsible for any sort of disturbance in the collective picture of calm, peace, and harmony, right? At the expense of who, right? Often the victim, right? Who's often exiled at speaking their truth? The victim, right? So again, in that place of child abuse, that continues out, right? If your caregiver is going to be the one that is causing you the most harm, that puts this level of abuse down below a concentration camp. In a concentration camp, the child isn't running to the guard for safety. The child isn't running to the guard for a skint up knee, right? Now, these folks' reality is always being challenged, almost more today than as a child, because as a child, they weren't necessarily speaking out, right? And today they are often, right? Now, another piece too is that the folks with PTSD, the highly sensitive, are often really judged around their quote exaggerated responses to the situation. Now, I'm going to share a story. Just recently, after all my years of work, right? My father is passing away. I'm in New Mexico at the time, and I have to drive halfway across the country to Missouri. And along that drive, I come to a peace within myself that I could walk back in and be in a room with my brothers and whoever happened to be around. Um, so I am standing in a room with my youngest brother, all of his children, my children, grandchildren, and he proceeds to tell me that my father, through layers of gibberish dementia, decided to declare to him that he had molested me. And my body was literally physically thrown backwards. This was not a truth that I ever expected to be released. I always expected it to just be my word against theirs. Not his, you notice I'm saying theirs. And I look at my brother, and the only words I could muster was, "Are you sure he was talking about me?" And he said, "Yes, I do assume so. Yes." And we talked a little bit, and, obviously I was in shock. The next day I wake up and I realize that, he had he had expressed to me that he had this piece of information for 5 months. So for 5 months, he had been walking around with this piece of truth that was my truth, playing God over who needed to know it. So eventually, oddly, he decided that I had the right to this piece of information. I also realized that he chose to tell me in a crowded room of people so that I could have no response, right? I'm the crazy one. So for me to show emotion at that moment would have validated all of that. So by the end of the next day, I just get in my car and drive away. I drive back to New Mexico. I just drive, right? I'm like, how can this even be possible? I get back to New Mexico and I'm like, how far can I get away from these people? How far? So I get in my car and I drive to all the way to the tip of the Yucatan in Mexico. And I'm there for 8 months. Now, what's interesting is I get a call from my stepbrother who, was angry at me about this piece of information because my brother had decided to tell my stepbrother. No one else. My mother, my real brother, any of the people that have been standing with a baseball bat ready to swing at me, not a word. Not a word. And when I spoke to my mother about it, he declared he didn't know if it was true and he didn't think it was his place to share. That's what we live with. That's what we live with every day. Somebody playing God with our truth and being exiled, right, from family functions. And, the crazy thing is that we want to go in spite because we just still yearn for that idea of family. Right? So this is a constant, perpetual, 100-year self conversation these people are having. And listen, this is a completely exhausting life. Can you imagine? A completely exhausting life where your truth is being challenged at every corner, right? At every corner. You're managing, you're coping, you're strategizing on how to function in a world where your body is collapsing, your reality is challenged, right? So often, right, we have folks apologizing about the past when what is real and true is the hurt is happening today, right? I just had that conversation with my mother as well. I said, Mom, I'm not here to talk to you about what dad did 45 years ago. What I'm here to talk to you about is what's happening today. And this withholding of information is happening today, right? So we have to realize that this battle, the abuse, all of it doesn't just stop. Now, why we don't tell. This is interesting, right? Why we don't tell. Often we're laden with threats. Now, again, the gaslighting threats, right? I remember when I was about 17, my boyfriend chooses to tell my mother everything. And when she approaches me, she said, Is that true? I said, Yes. She said, Well, I wouldn't tell grandma because you're going to cause her to have a heart attack, right? And at this point, I was 17. It still worked. My grandmother never knew, right? Often we split the yucky part away from the person that we interact with daily, right? So often the abuser, that version, that energetic version of them, they turn into a monster, right? And then there's the daytime version of them that we love because we don't we we don't want to lose the little bit of love and care that we do have, right? So another level of fragmentation. Now, I want to open this up with a story of a client whose story is twisted and tangled generationally. Her grandfather was a well respected, lovable, protective man. He valued family. He was an icon in the church, and he taught the female children in the family how to please a man. Their education began at around 5 years old. Now, the cut to the chase version is that he impregnated his daughter and had a continued relationship with her throughout the years. She had two children, and the older of the two, Paula, was his child. Now, with the assistance of mom, her sister, he began to teach her two girls. He ended up impregnating the younger of the two. Now, by 14, she committed suicide. And through this, Paula developed what they labeled as a psychosis. She walked around as if she were in a trance for about 6 months, right? She ended up having a huge awakening around it all. She ended up falling down a well, crazily enough. And when she opened her eyes to all these memories about Grandpa. Right? Did she need them at the moment? Yes, because he was getting ready to start with her daughter, right? Who was also getting molested by her natural father, right? The cycles of sexual abuse are systemic and throughout generations. Back to Paula. She always had a memory of a man coming into the girl's bedroom in the night, right? And in her memory, she has him over her sister's bed. Now, interspersed throughout our discoveries, almost as if it were another version of her, she would blurt out, I wonder if Papa's my dad. And then the next second, right, the thought is closed off as if it were sealed away and had never been spoken, right? Now, a child's often going to separate the nighttime version from the daytime version. I'm working with a little girl right now that has a biting monster and a big fluffy monster that comes to her room at night, right? Now, finding, you know, who those versions belong to, right, opens the door to truth and information that's going to eventually set her free, right? Now, Paula loved daytime Papa. He was the only thing she could ever depend on. She was the one he loved most out of anyone, right? And then the nighttime, the shadow man, she was terrified of him, right? Now, I did the same thing with sexual pleasure. When I was young, it was a very, very messy thing to maneuver. Your body reacting one way in the physical, and your mind being so repulsed and afraid, right? So, what do? I created a monster. And when I would start feeling pleasure, the monster would come up, which would divert my fear or my body, my mind away from pleasure and to fear and action, right? Who was this monster? The man who was standing before me, right? Because if I could turn my body off, I could have the conscious awareness to fight, right? So whenever I needed to focus in the middle of a situation, especially sexually, I would throw up a monster. Now, in the long run, was that great for me? No, because as a grown up, the monster still came, right? I didn't know how to disengage that. I didn't know I had even created it in the first place. Now, what I notice when people first come in, often, they have diagnosis of ADD. They say they start things, they can't finish them. Usually, the sentences are very fragmented, a half a sentence here, an end of a sentence there. Their energy is scattered all over the place. And just finding a through line with the conversation, right, could be a challenge, hence your detective skills. When we're triggered, we're operating within a previous program. Is it always children? Of course not, but always previous, right? We're not having a future fragment. We're not coming in with completely new information. No, the fragment knows everything that it knew up to the moment outside of the other tied off loops containing hidden information, right? So the fragments are going to show up under pressure, right? When the version that's here feels like it needs rescuing or support. Crazily enough, our kids come out of the woodwork to fight for us, right? Now, as we spoke about before, when we're triggered, the only information you have is the information you had previous knowledge of, right? Whatever you have gained access through the years, you don't have access to, right? So the information is very limited, very much like looking through a peephole. Now, our job is to help them see what else is there. So when we're jumping somebody, it's like they're looking through a peephole. Fear narrows our scope of information, right? So part of our job as this psychic detective is to point them to the discrepancies, to point them to the missing information, not give it to them, point them to it. Things are real when we do it ourselves, and there are tangible changes, right? Now, what's really cool is the more honed our skills get around the jumping through the timeline, when we can get to that very first moment where a cycle was created and things started going sideways, and we're honed enough to really focus in on that programming and shift the root thoughts and the root words that are anchoring that fragment there, right? We can dissolve that whole loop or the whole cycle in one jump. I've watched it happen over and over and over again. Now sometimes people will, you know, a couple, 3 sessions later say, "It's crazy because I kind of forget that happened to me," right? Which is beautiful. When we go from a 10 to a 2, the fire's not burning. What always has your attention if a fire's burning? The fire, not the flowers that are around it. So if someone's raped, I would investigate whether it was the first time that they had had any sort of sexual violation, right? Or had there been previous infractions? And I would want to excavate the earliest loop that I can discover, right? And dismantle it while observing what transpired within the current trauma that they're experiencing today. See what I'm saying? So we're finding that picture that that resembles the current situation or the current thoughts around the situation the closest. And as I said, we can often dismantle a cycle within one jump. Alternate personality, right, versus traditional fragments. I found this very curious. Like, what is the distinctions that create a strong enough sever that human being is operating as if it were two singular beings, right? That I became completely intrigued with that, right? Where there are numerous souls inhabiting one body, or were the fragments so strong and so big that they carry more weight than the fragment that is operating the human form of today? In my work, what I witnessed were the fragments had more molecular weight than what was occupying the body I was working with. I was working with this beautiful young woman who had alternate personality disorder, and she would lose sometimes days where the alter would have complete control over situations. And grown up Brooke, it was as if they put her in a closet. She couldn't remember anything about it. Right now, in my work, right, when I would see Brooke get super uncomfortable, I would watch the distortion in her body and her come back as one of the alters or fragments. So my shift had to be very fluid into the conversation around it, with a angry 13-year-old versus crying Brooke, right? And she would shift emotionally that quickly, right? The most amazing day was when I jumped Brooke back and we were able to stay with the current Brooke through the whole thing, right? And the fragment um, took the back seat, right? Because we have to understand, like, if you've got a 13-year-old in charge of your adult life, number one, a lot of responsibility for a 13-year-old. And number two, is she going to make choices that are going to serve you in your life of today? right? Now, another piece to this, and this is just a wondering, how, if someone is going to put tons of attention on one of these fragments, give it a new name, dress it up in new clothes, and individualize it, right? Um, wow, if a therapist had done that with me, I think putting me back together would have been a different conversation. Brooke had alternate personality disorder. She did not have them individualized to where they were completely separate people. Now, in my conversations with others with DID, I've seen that as a spectrum, right? Where on one hand, it was cool to have all these parts and to not have to be responsible necessarily for what every one of them was doing, right? And I'm going to say that because I was that, and I feel I have the right to say it, right? So I think that there is a level of responsibility that comes with the want to integrate. Right? Now, Brooke was pretty skeptical, and her alters were very challenged with the thought of integration. Now, interestingly enough, they didn't want to integrate with her. They thought she was weak. They thought she was unwise. She made really unwise choices for all of them. She put them in danger, and they didn't want to be a part of her. Right? So that became a conversation. Can you save Brooke? Can you help her maneuver life today so that, and Brooke had a 2-year old, and I use that 2-year old a lot in these conversations, right? Was this 2-year old going to end up in the same position they are and were if they choose not to help? And, so we were able to talk them all into cooperation around the integration process. But it was definitely different to maneuver than, well, on one hand, different to maneuver than a typical jump where we're working with adult mind, right? Our challenge there is to bring them down into child mind and find a common ground. And I guess it was the same but different, right? And yeah, so I truly, really believe that the only difference is the molecular weight of the fragment. Now, what's super cool with Brooke is she did that. And she did all of that. And she claims ownership of her power and her gifts and her abilities to have untangled all that. And today, she's doing amazing, right? She's back to work. She'd been on disability since she was in her late teens. She's back to work and she's starting her own business. She was recently released from the care of her lifelong psychiatrist, right? She's out of off disability and her life has started. That is possible. That is so possible.